They say true honor is not in medals nor in uniforms, but in the choices made when no one is watching. Some men carry glory in silence, living among us unnoticed, while their names echo only on the lips of those who once stood beside them in fire and smoke. This is not just a Veterans Day story. It is the story of an old man who seemed forgotten, a man with an expired ID card, yet whose presence carried the weight of battles and sacrifices beyond imagination. If you believe that justice, though delayed, always finds its way, stay with me through this story. And don't forget to follow, like, and share your thoughts so that more people can hear this unforgettable tale. Arthur Shaw walked toward the main gate of Fort Walker with the unhurried steps of a man who had long abandoned the need to rush. The Arizona morning air was sharp, the kind that carried both freshness and a quiet sting, as if reminding everyone of time's relentless passage. Shaw's tall but thin frame carried decades of discipline, shoulders squared, spine unbent, an old soldier's posture refusing to bow to age. In his weathered hand, two objects clung to him as though they were extensions of his very being. A tattered military identification card, its edges soft like paper worn thin by years of touch, and a sealed envelope, the government tape still unbroken. To any bystander, these would seem like trivial items, but to Shaw, they were the weight of memory and duty. "Good morning," he said softly to the young officer at the checkpoint, his voice calm, almost fragile, yet carrying a quiet authority. Lieutenant Miller, barely in his 20s, fresh from officer school, held up the old ID with a mocking smile. "Sir, this expired in 1994. You can't expect this to work anymore." His words were sharp, tinged with condescension. Behind him, Sergeant Lopez chuckled, his booming laugh drawing others closer. The guards looked on, some amused, some shifting uncomfortably, but none stepping forward. Arthur Shaw didn't respond. He simply extended his hand, took back the ID, and pocketed it with the same composure as one might fold away an old letter. His silence was heavier than words, carrying not weakness, but restraint. His dignity in that moment stood in stark contrast to the ridicule surrounding him. Without protest, he turned and began walking back toward the public parking lot, each step deliberate, unhurried, almost ceremonial. From a distance, Private Rick Hernandez observed the scene with an uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Unlike the others, Rick couldn't join in the laughter. There was something in Shaw's silence, in the way he carried himself, that didn't fit the image of a confused old man clinging to the past. It reminded him of the stories his father used to tell, of the quiet professionals of the old guard, men who served without fanfare and lived without demanding recognition. As Shaw sat down on a bench just beyond the gate, the desert wind ruffling his brown jacket, Rick whispered to himself the words his father often repeated: "When everyone turns their back, only conscience remains." Inside the cafeteria, Helen Martinez overheard the guards joking about the old-timer with the ancient ID. At the mention of his description, a thin man, upright, quiet, brown jacket, Helen froze. Memory flooded back. She had seen that face before, decades ago, when a fire broke out in the weapons depot. 3 men trapped inside, and 1 man had gone in without hesitation, dragging them out through smoke and flame. That man was now sitting outside the gate, turned away as if he were nobody. By mid-morning, whispers began to travel through the base. Who was he? Why had Helen recognized him? Could it be true that this man had once saved Colonel Reynolds himself? Rick, unsettled, pulled out his phone and made a call to his uncle at the Pentagon. "Uncle Jim, I need you to check a name. Arthur Shaw, probably commissioned in the 70s or earlier. Something about him doesn't feel right." His voice trembled with urgency. He hung up, eyes locked on Shaw, who remained seated, patient, as though waiting for time itself to decide what would come next. The truth lingered, unseen but heavy, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. And in that quiet moment outside the gates of Fort Walker, a question began to rise. Not in words, but in the weight of silence. Who exactly was Arthur Shaw? The soldiers laughed, but one man remembered. The guards dismissed him, but history had not. And as Shaw sat with his envelope resting on his lap, his weathered fingers brushing against its sealed edge, it was clear that what lay within was not for him alone. It was for the ghosts of men whose names were etched in stone, and for the living who had forgotten the price of freedom. On that Veterans Day morning, an old man with an expired ID card carried the kind of honor no protocol could measure. Yet no one at the gate had seen it, except the quiet conscience of a young private and the fading memory of a cafeteria worker who knew heroes sometimes wear no medals. The wound was hidden still, but the day had only begun, and the truth, long buried, was about to find its voice. The desert sun climbed higher as Arthur Shaw remained seated on the weathered bench outside Fort Walker's gate. His face was impassive, yet behind those deep-set eyes lay a gallery of memories, each more vivid than the dust and stone around him. For Shaw, the sight of the memorial wall inside the base was not merely a reminder of the past. It was a doorway to it. In his mind, the years rolled backward like a film reel. He was no longer an old man dismissed for an expired card, but a commander in the prime of his strength, standing among men who trusted him with their lives. Back then, the air was thick with the scent of wet earth, gunpowder, and fear. Vietnam, 1971. The jungle swallowed sound, yet the echo of distant gunfire always lingered, like thunder that never ended. One mission in particular rose from the depths of memory. The night was blacker than ink when his team slipped across enemy lines. The objective? Extraction of American prisoners from a hidden camp. Shaw remembered the quiet before the storm, his men crouched low, waiting for a signal. He could still see the anxious eyes of the youngest soldier in his unit, barely 20, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Shaw placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, whispering, "Breathe, we leave no one behind." The raid erupted in chaos. Bullets tore through bamboo huts, shouts in foreign tongues rang out, and flames lit the night. Yet somehow, against impossible odds, they brought out every prisoner, 28 men, without losing a single soldier. That night, his team had written their own legend, though most of it would remain classified. Shaw had refused decorations, telling his superiors, the mission was the reward. Recognition belongs to the men, not me. But legends came with shadows. Not all missions ended without loss. He remembered the operation in Cambodia when the jungle canopy became both shield and coffin. Men under his command fell, their names etched forever in his soul. Every Veterans Day since, Shaw wrote letters to their families. Letters filled with truth, regret, and gratitude, though he never sent them. They were his way of standing watch over the fallen, long after the battlefield had gone silent. Back at Fort Walker, Helen Martinez's words to the guards spread like wildfire. That man saved lives in '89. I saw it with my own eyes. Her certainty made others uneasy. Could they have mocked a man who had once pulled comrades from fire and death? One junior officer searched old photos in Colonel Reynolds' office and found a grainy image of a tall soldier with the same unmistakable posture. "It looks like him," someone whispered. Meanwhile, Shaw's silence remained unbroken. His envelope rested on his lap, sealed tight. The names written inside those pages burned in his mind. Sullivan, Williams, Lopez, each one a story unfinished, each one a promise he had carried for decades. That envelope was his reason for coming today, his burden and his offering. Private Rick Hernandez could no longer ignore his instincts. "Something about him doesn't fit," he muttered, staring out the guard booth window. He remembered his father's stories about officers who never sought glory, only duty. Officers who measured honor not by medals, but by the lives they protected. Rick's call to his uncle at the Pentagon echoed with urgency. "Arthur Shaw, check the name, please." 20 long minutes later, the phone rang again. Rick's hand trembled as he answered. "Private Hernandez." A stern voice came through the line. "This is Colonel Wexler, Pentagon Special Operations Historical Division. I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately." Inside the checkpoint office, Lieutenant Miller's smirk faded as he took the call. When Wexler revealed the truth that the man they had mocked was none other than Colonel Arthur E. Shaw, former commander of Bravo Team, legendary in Vietnam and Cambodia, the room fell silent. Lopez's broad shoulders stiffened, and Miller's face drained of color. Yet outside, Shaw remained motionless, unaware of the storm his presence had stirred. The past, long hidden, had begun to surface, not through his own words, but through the whispers of those who had not forgotten. For Shaw, the echoes of the past were heavy but steady, like a drumbeat in his chest. He had not come for recognition, nor to claim respect. He had come for the men whose names lived only in stone and memory, men whose lives had been cut short, while he, by some twist of fate, had walked away. And so he waited, silent, as the weight of history caught up to the present. Soon those around him would realize the truth. The quiet old man at the gate was no stranger, no imposter. He was the keeper of promises made long ago in jungles half a world away. If you believe that respect must be earned in silence, let this story remind you, sometimes silence itself becomes the loudest cry for justice. Don't forget to follow and share this tale so that others may hear the lesson carried through generations. The phone in the checkpoint office clicked off with a final chilling statement from Colonel Wexler. Extend every courtesy to Colonel Shaw until his transport arrives. The room fell into stunned quiet, the laughter that had mocked an old man replaced by a suffocating weight of shame. Lieutenant Miller's face was pale. Lopez stared at the floor, and the younger guards shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance dissolving. Outside, the sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. A black SUV rolled up to the gate, its tinted windows lowering to reveal a full-bird colonel and two decorated officers. They stepped out with urgent precision, their movements sharp, purposeful. Miller swallowed hard. He had never snapped to attention so quickly in his life. "I'm Colonel Harris," the officer announced firmly. "Where is Arthur Shaw?" His voice carried not just authority, but something more. Reverence. Miller, ashamed, pointed wordlessly to the bench where Shaw still sat, calm, envelope in hand, as though waiting for this very moment. Colonel Harris strode to Shaw and with crisp exactness raised a salute. The old man rose slowly, returning it with the flawless precision of a soldier who had saluted 1,000 times before. Words were exchanged softly, hands shaken, and the sealed envelope passed into Harris's care. Around them, young soldiers looked on in disbelief. The frail man they had dismissed minutes ago now stood honored by officers who carried rows of ribbons across their chests. Yet beneath the formality, tension brewed. Miller's pride had been shattered, and in his gut burned humiliation. He had dismissed a pay whose very name carried weight in military history. For the first time in his young career, Miller realized the limits of procedure. Rules had blinded him to honor. Inside the checkpoint office, Lopez muttered, "Cambodia rescue mission. That's like finding out you cursed at Rambo." His attempt at levity only deepened the shame. Miller ran a hand down his face, his voice breaking. "We just insulted a living legend." While the guards wrestled with their disgrace, Shaw was escorted past the gate. Soldiers who had gathered nearby straightened instantly, lining the road, their boots clicking in unison as they saluted. A sight reserved for generals was now offered to a man in a worn brown jacket. Shaw acknowledged them with a measured nod, his composure never cracking, his silence never broken. But for Shaw, inside, memory struck like shrapnel. As he walked the familiar paths of the base, ghosts of younger days pressed against him. He remembered the weight of decisions that could not be undone. Orders given, lives risked, comrades lost. He had led men into fire, and though many returned, not all had. That burden was his alone to carry, and every Veterans Day it returned with the same crushing force. At the memorial wall, Shaw paused, tracing names carved in granite. He stood among young soldiers, yet he seemed utterly alone. Miller, unable to resist, followed at a distance, shame thick in his chest. He wanted to speak, to apologize, yet words seemed too small. Finally, summoning courage, he approached. "Colonel Shaw, sir," Miller began, his voice shaking. "I want to apologize for my behavior this morning. I was disrespectful, judgmental." Shaw turned slowly, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. Then Shaw spoke, his voice calm, almost weary. "You were doing your job, Lieutenant." "No, sir," Miller replied, fighting to hold his composure. "I was following procedure, but I wasn't doing my job. My job is to protect this base while honoring those who've served. I failed." Shaw studied the young officer, his expression softening just slightly. "The fault isn't yours. It's in how you were trained to see people. In my day, we were taught to evaluate the man, not just his credentials. Somewhere along the way, that lesson was lost." The words struck Miller harder than any reprimand could. He felt his throat tighten, his shame magnified by the quiet truth in Shaw's statement. It was not just a personal failure. It was a failure of perspective, one that ran deeper than rules or regulations. Behind them, soldiers whispered. Some recognized Shaw's name from their father's stories. Others simply stared at the man who carried himself with a dignity that demanded no explanation. The air around the memorial seemed heavier, as though the weight of history itself pressed upon the young recruits, reminding them that honor was not in the shine of medals, but in the substance of sacrifice. By midday, the base commander arrived, a two-star general who had flown in upon hearing of Shaw's presence. An impromptu assembly was ordered in the auditorium. 200 young recruits filled the seats, senior officers lining the walls, the air electric with anticipation. Shaw, still in his simple khaki pants and blue shirt, walked to the podium with deliberate steps. He stood silently for a moment, his presence enough to still the restless room. Then, in a voice quiet but carrying, he began, "I didn't come here for recognition. I came to pay respects to men who didn't make it home, men whose names are on that wall outside." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the young faces before him. Honor isn't in the uniform, or the rank, or the ID card. Honor is how you conduct yourself when no one is watching. It is the promise you keep when keeping it is hardest. The room held its breath. For the first time, many realized the truth Miller had failed to see at the gate. Honor cannot be measured by appearances. It is written in sacrifice, in silence, in the lives saved and the promises kept. And with those words, the breaking point came, not through anger or force, but through truth. A truth that would stay with every soldier present long after the old colonel's voice fell silent. The afternoon sun slanted across Fort Walker, casting long shadows on the memorial wall. The echoes of Colonel Shaw's speech still hung in the air, a weighty silence that lingered even as the recruits filed out of the auditorium. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard honor described not as a regulation or a decoration, but as something invisible, tested only when no one was watching. Lieutenant Miller remained at the back of the hall long after the others had left. His shoulders, once square with pride, now slumped under the burden of realization. Everything he thought he knew about respect, about leadership, had been challenged in one morning by a man carrying nothing more than an expired ID and a sealed envelope. He replayed Shaw's words over and over. Evaluate the man, not just his credentials. The illusion that credentials defined character had shattered. Shaw, meanwhile, moved quietly through the base, escorted not as a visitor, but as a figure of reverence. Soldiers who had never heard his name just hours ago now straightened instinctively as he passed, their eyes following him with a mix of awe and humility. Yet Shaw himself sought no attention. His focus remained steady on the memorial wall, where the names of fallen comrades seemed to glow in the fading light. At the wall, he stood silently for a long while, fingers brushing across engraved letters. Williams, Sullivan, Lopez. Each name was a memory, each letter carved in stone, a face that still lived in his mind. Shaw had carried those names for decades, written them in annual letters, folded them into envelopes he thought no one had ever seen. Today, those ghosts pressed closer than ever. It was there at the wall that Sergeant Lopez approached. His normally booming voice faltered as he spoke. "Sir, my father was at Cam Ranh Bay in '72. He always said a colonel arranged the extraction that saved his unit. Was that you?" Shaw's eyes met the young sergeant's, his expression unreadable. "What was your father's name, son?" "Carlos Lopez, sir, 5th Infantry." For a moment, Shaw seemed to drift back through time. Then he nodded slowly. "I remember the operation. Your father was brave. He helped carry 2 wounded men to the extraction point." Sergeant Lopez's eyes widened. "He never told me that part." "The brave ones rarely do," Shaw replied, his voice low but steady. The sergeant stood in stunned silence, his illusions about his father's stories and about Shaw himself crumbling all at once. Shaw was no myth. He was standing right before him, flesh and bone, a man who had once carried the weight of impossible missions. Elsewhere on the base, the story of the morning spread like wildfire. From the cafeteria to the barracks, whispers turned into retellings, each soldier adding a detail they had heard. The depot fire in '89, the Cambodia rescue mission, the Vietnam extractions. Young recruits who had mocked Shaw hours earlier now spoke his name with reverence. The illusion of him as just an old man dissolved into the truth of a commander who had lived honor without ever demanding recognition. Yet for Shaw himself, there was no triumph in these revelations. If anything, they deepened the loneliness he carried. Recognition was never his pursuit. Remembrance was. The men whose names covered the memorial wall would never walk through those gates, never give speeches, never be saluted. To Shaw, their absence was the real story. His own survival felt less like fortune and more like a debt unpaid. Late in the day, Miller found the courage to approach again. This time, there was no audience, no eyes upon him, only the quiet figure of Shaw standing at the wall. "Sir," Miller began, his voice subdued, "I don't know how to make this right." Shaw's gaze remained on the stone. "You already have, Lieutenant. You saw the truth today." "But Miller hesitated, shame nodding his words. "I dismissed you. I treated you like—" Shaw turned then, his eyes calm but piercing. "We all make mistakes. What matters is whether we learn from them. You learned today. That's more than most." The words, spoken without judgment, struck Miller harder than reprimand ever could. His illusions of superiority, his faith in procedure as the measure of worth, cracked fully in that moment. He realized that honor could not be worn on a sleeve or proven with a plastic card. It had to be lived. Nearby, preparations were underway for an impromptu honor guard procession. Soldiers gathered in dress uniform, forming lines that stretched across the main thoroughfare. The base commander himself oversaw the arrangements, determined to give Shaw the reception his name deserved. By the time Shaw was escorted back through the gate, the scene was extraordinary. Every soldier present stood rigidly at attention, saluting with reverence, usually reserved for generals. Shaw paused only long enough to return the salute, his movements exact, his face serene. To the soldiers watching, it was a moment of revelation. To Shaw, it was simply another duty fulfilled, one last gesture of respect before turning back to the quiet anonymity he had chosen for decades. The day's events had left the base changed. For the young, illusions of what honor looked like had shattered, replaced by the truth embodied in a single man. For the older veterans, long-buried memories returned, reminding them that some heroes walk quietly, unnoticed, until history forces their names back into the light. And for Shaw, though he carried the weight of loss, there flickered a fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, the next generation would remember the lesson. Honor does not fade, even when credentials expire. The sun dipped low over Fort Walker, gilding the memorial wall in amber light. The honor guard had dispersed, the crowd had thinned, yet Colonel Arthur Shaw remained standing before the engraved names, his hand resting on cool stone. The day had been long, filled with humiliation, revelation, and a recognition he had never sought. But beneath it all lay the same truth that had brought him here: remembrance. In his pocket, the weight of years still pressed against him. Dozens of letters, carefully written, tucked in envelopes, addressed to families whose sons never returned. He had carried them like a ritual, writing one each Veterans Day. Until today, he had believed they remained unread, private confessions of guilt and gratitude. A quiet voice broke his solitude. An intelligence officer flown in from Washington stepped close and spoke gently. "Colonel, there's something you should know. Those letters you've written, they were delivered." Shaw blinked, momentarily startled. "Delivered? How? I never sent them." "You wrote names, addresses. Our monitoring system flagged you every year when you activated your old ID. We sent someone to check. We made sure the families received your words. They've kept them, Colonel. Some have every single letter." For the first time all day, Shaw's composure cracked. His lips trembled, his breath caught in his chest. Decades of sorrow, folded into words he thought lost to time, had reached the people they were meant for. "The Sullivan family? The Williams in Georgia?" The officer nodded. "All of them, every year." Shaw's eyes glistened, and he lowered his head, a quiet exhale carrying both relief and grief. The burden he had carried, alone in silence, had in truth been shared, year after year, by families who had clung to his words as proof that their loved ones had not been forgotten. It was not forgiveness, but it was healing. Nearby, Sergeant Lopez stood watching, His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "Sir, my father always told me that true leaders never left their men behind. I see now what he meant." Shaw offered no reply, only a faint nod, his gaze returning to the wall. For him, every name carved into the stone was a voice in his memory, a reminder of duty unfulfilled. Yet knowing his words had reached their families eased the weight he had borne for so long. As evening settled, Shaw prepared to leave. The base commander approached, offering a final gesture of respect. "Colonel, we'd like to dedicate this gate in your honor. A plaque will be placed here. It will read, 'Shaw Gate, in honor of quiet valor.'" Shaw paused, his expression thoughtful. Then he said quietly, "If you must inscribe something, let it be this: honor endures long after credentials expire." The commander nodded solemnly. "So it shall be." When Shaw stepped toward the waiting SUV, Lieutenant Miller stood rigidly at attention. His face was set, his eyes burning with both respect and regret. As the vehicle rolled past, Shaw met his gaze and raised a salute. Miller returned it sharply, the gesture carrying more meaning than any apology. In that silent exchange lay a promise that the lesson had been learned and it would not be forgotten. Months passed. Shaw returned to his quiet life in the Arizona desert, declining interviews and refusing honors. The Pentagon incident became known only in whispers, taught at officer schools as a parable of humility and judgment. His expired ID card was placed in the Fort Walker Historical Collection, displayed with a single line beneath it, "An expired ID but honor that never will." Private Rick Hernandez, the young soldier whose instinct had sparked the truth, received an unexpected transfer to Officer Candidate School. At his graduation, he told the story of that Veterans Day. "Never judge a warrior by the date on a card," he said. "Judge them by the honor in their actions." His words spread among new recruits, planting seeds of humility and respect. As for Shaw, he continued writing his annual letters. Each November, he sat at his modest desk, pen scratching across paper, names returning to him with the clarity of fire and smoke. Now, though, he wrote with a different certainty. He knew those letters would reach the families, that his words would carry remembrance long after he was gone. When Shaw passed at the age of 89, his final letter was found on the desk. In it, he wrote, "Honor does not fade, it only needs one person to remember it. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Do not give up when you are doing what is right." At his memorial, veterans who had served under him spoke not of medals or missions, but of loyalty, humility, and sacrifice. The bronze plaque at Fort Walker gleamed in the sunlight, its inscription a reminder to every young soldier who passed through the gate: honor endures long after credentials expire. The long road to healing was never about recognition. It was about remembrance, about carrying the weight of the fallen with dignity, and about teaching the living that true valor speaks quietly, but forever. And so, the story of Colonel Arthur Shaw lived on, not in headlines or history books, but in the lessons whispered from one generation of soldiers to the next. The quiet proof that even when the world forgets, honor remembers. Honor is not found in medals, uniforms, or credentials. It lives in choices made when no one is watching, in promises kept long after the battles have ended. Arthur Shaw's story is a reminder that silence can hold more power than words, and that healing begins with remembrance. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, follow for more unforgettable tales, and let others hear that honor, once earned, never fades.